The night it happened, the city was quiet. Rain slicked the windows of a downtown apartment. And somewhere between the thrum of traffic and the ticking of a clock, Michael Reed sat at his kitchen table, staring at an envelope. Inside it, $10,000 in crisp hundreds. Outside, written in his careful, deliberate handwriting, were just 3 words: "For your silence." Across the room, Anna stood by the door, her coat half on, her eyes red but dry. She didn't ask him to change his mind. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with the kind of exhaustion that comes when a heart has been wrung out and left to dry. Then, without a word, she took the envelope, slipped it into a bag, and left. When the door closed, Michael exhaled like a man surfacing from underwater. He told himself it was necessary, that it was the only way to fix what he'd broken. But as the elevator cables hummed and her footsteps faded down the hallway, the silence she left behind began to take shape. It wasn't peaceful. It was loud and echoing, pulsing void that filled every corner of his life. They had met 5 years earlier, in a way that was almost cinematic to strangers trapped in an elevator between floors 17 and 18. She had been reading the picture of Dorian Gray, the spine cracked, pages worn. He had been on a call, trying to land an account his firm had been chasing for months. When the lights flickered and the car shuddered to a stop, she laughed a soft, surprised laugh that cut through his frustration like sunlight. In that half hour between shared jokes and nervous glances at the emergency light, something invisible settled between them. By the time they were rescued, Michael had forgotten the call, the account, and even his own agenda. All he could think of was how effortlessly she had turned panic into calm. How she smiled like she knew secrets about the world he never thought to ask. Anna worked as a photographer, freelance, unpredictable, always chasing moments rather than money. Michael's world was precise, corporate, controlled. But in the early months, their differences stitched them together like 2 pieces of cloth that shouldn't fit but somehow do. She taught him to slow down, to see the way light moved across a window pane or how strangers brushed past each other without realizing they were part of the same story. He in turn gave her structure, a place to land when her world spun too fast. It wasn't perfect, but for a while, it was enough. Then came the project, the one that would change everything. Michael's firm had secured a client with ties to city development, a sprawling construction deal worth millions. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, the kind of success that defined a man, but beneath the contracts and handshakes, there were secrets, backroom favors, hidden payoffs, falsified safety reports. Michael knew it. He'd seen the numbers that didn't add up, the corners that had been cut. He'd told himself it wasn't his concern, but Anna saw everything differently. She had been documenting the lives of displaced families for a photo series when she stumbled onto the same construction site. Her camera caught what the contracts had buried: leaking pipes, cracked supports, the kind of neglect that whispered of tragedy waiting to happen. When she realized Michael's name was tied to it, she confronted him not with anger, but with disbelief. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew, and you let them keep going," he tried to explain. Tried to tell her that sometimes doing the right thing meant losing everything else. But the more he justified, the smaller she seemed to become in front of him, until finally she just said, "I don't know who you are anymore." That night she left his apartment without taking her coat. The rain soaked her hair, the city swallowing her as she disappeared into the dark. For weeks Michael drowned himself in work, convincing himself that distance was for the best. Then one morning he woke to find one of her photos on the front page of the paper, the construction site, the neglected structure, the truth exposed. The headline called for accountability. The city called for answers. And Michael's name was suddenly on everyone's lips. The fallout was swift. His company imploded under investigation. He lost his position, his standing, his reputation. And yet, somewhere beneath the ruin, he felt something like relief. Until the call came, a man's voice, low and measured. "She's about to publish the rest. Names, numbers, everything. If that happens, it's not just your firm. People you don't even know exist will come for her. Make sure she disappears." You understand, Michael didn't ask who the man was. He didn't need to. That's how the envelope came to be. $10,000, and the unspoken plea for her to leave it all behind. He found her at a coffee shop on 7th, her camera bag at her feet, a half-drunk cappuccino cooling by her hand. She looked tired but not surprised. When he slid the envelope across the table, she didn't touch it. "Is that what I'm worth to you?" "It's not that," he said. "It's for your safety." She stared at him for a long time. "You think money can keep people safe?" He didn't answer. In the end, she took the envelope not because she wanted to, but because she saw something in his eyes that scared her. A man unraveling, a man trying to buy silence not from her, but from his own guilt. And just like that, she was gone. Days bled into weeks. The investigations faded, replaced by new scandals, new headlines. Michael tried to rebuild, new city, new job, smaller apartment, but the quiet moments were the worst. The hum of the refrigerator at night, the hollow sound of footsteps echoing where hers used to be. He found her absence everywhere. In the smell of coffee grounds, the way sunlight filtered through blinds, the half-empty drawer she'd once claimed. Even her laughter haunted him, a sound he couldn't remember clearly anymore, only the space it had once filled. Then, one evening, as autumn settled over the city, a package arrived at his door. No return address. Inside, a single photograph was of the old construction site. The building stood half-finished, wrapped in scaffolding, abandoned after the scandal. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a figure, a woman in a grey coat, camera raised, capturing something just beyond the edge of the image. She was alive, still watching, still telling stories. And beneath the photos, scrawled in ink he recognized instantly, "You can silence what isn't afraid of being heard." Michael sat at his kitchen table long after the sun went down, the photograph trembling in his hand. Something inside him cracked open, and for the first time, he realized what he had really paid for. Not her silence. Not her safety. He had paid for a version of peace that couldn't exist without her truth. Over the following weeks, he began to see her photographs everywhere, at galleries, online features, social campaigns. Her work had found a voice that reached farther than he ever could, and with each new image it felt as though she was speaking directly to him, reminding him of the man he used to be, the one she believed in before the world hardened him. He wanted to reach out, to tell her he understood now, that he was ready to listen. But every time he tried, the same fear stopped him, the fear that he'd done something unforgivable, until the night he saw her again. It was by chance, or maybe it wasn't. A public exhibition, open air beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Her photographs hung along a courtyard wall, illuminated like fragments of memory. He moved slowly, his hands buried in his pockets, afraid that if he looked too long she might vanish again. And then there she was, across the crowd, dressed simply, her hair tied back, her eyes fixed on one of the prints. She hadn't noticed him yet. For a moment he just watched the way the light brushed her face, the familiar tilt of her head. When she finally turned, their eyes met. Neither spoke, neither smiled. But something passed between them, a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they'd lost, and everything that still lingered. Then she nodded, once, almost imperceptibly, before turning away, disappearing into the sea of strangers. Michael didn't follow. He stood there until the lights dimmed, until the photographs came down and the night folded back into itself. When he returned home, the silence felt different. Not empty, but full, alive with the weight of everything unsaid. He sat at his table again, staring at the photograph she'd once sent him, the same words at the bottom, now blurred by time. And as he traced the ink with his thumb, he noticed something he'd missed before. On the back of the photo, faint but legible, a new message. Just 4 words. "You still owe me." He froze. Was it a joke, a warning, or something else entirely? Outside, the city hummed with the restless sound of rain against glass. And in that moment, as he stared at the message, a single thought whispered through his mind, one that chilled him more than any threat ever could. Maybe her silence hadn't been bought after all. Maybe she was just waiting for him to listen. And then, from somewhere in the apartment, quiet, almost imperceptible, came the sound of a camera shutter clicking in the dark. The sound was so soft he almost convinced himself he imagined it. A faint, mechanical click, clean, deliberate, and close, too close. Michael froze. The apartment was dark except for the muted glow of the city bleeding through the blinds. He waited, every sense sharpened, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then again, the same sound. A camera shutter coming from somewhere inside the room. He rose slowly, eyes adjusting to the dark. Anna, the name slipped out before he could stop it, echoing in the still air. No answer. He moved toward the kitchen, every step calculated. The air felt heavy, the kind of silence that presses against the skin. He flicked on the light, empty, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the streetlight outside, nothing else. But then he saw it. On the counter, where the photograph had been, lay a small black device, a wireless camera, its lens pointed directly at him. The red light at the corner blinked once, then went dark. He stared at it, his throat tightening. Someone had been watching, recording. He unplugged it, turned it over in his hands. No brand, no markings, nothing to indicate where it came from. But deep down, he already knew. This wasn't random. It wasn't some break-in or a mistake. This was deliberate. A message. And the worst part, he couldn't tell if it was meant to threaten him or remind him that night. Sleep never came. He sat by the window, watching the reflection of the city ripple across the glass. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded into distance. He kept replaying the same thought. You still owe me. By morning, the words had grown heavier, like a weight pressing against his ribs. He couldn't stay in that apartment anymore, not with the air humming like a secret waiting to be told. So he packed a bag and left, not sure where he was going, only certain that he couldn't stay. He took the train north, out of the city. The skyline dissolved into rolling gray hills, industrial ruins, and long stretches of fog-soaked land. He remembered Anna once mentioning a small coastal town harbor's end where she'd gone to photograph the fishermen in their weathered boats. It had been one of her favorite places. She said, "It's the kind of place that listens when you're quiet," she'd told him once. He wasn't sure what he expected to find there. Maybe a clue, maybe just the sound of her absence again. When he arrived, the town looked like something out of one of her photographs, muted tones, peeling paint, the salt of the sea etched into every surface. The locals moved slowly, with the rhythm of people who'd long ago stopped rushing anywhere. He checked into a small inn by the harbor, the kind of place that smelled faintly of rain and old wood. That night he walked along the docks, the wind whipping through the rigging, gulls crying overhead. The sea stretched out like a sheet of black glass. Then he saw her. At first, he thought it was just another trick of memory, a silhouette standing at the end of the pier, camera raised toward the water. But the posture, the stillness, it was unmistakable. He started toward her, heart thundering. But before he could call out, she lowered the camera, turned, and disappeared into the fog. He ran to where she'd been. Nothing. Just the faint smell of salt and the sound of the tide hitting the rocks below. But on the wooden planks at his feet lay a single object, a roll of undeveloped film. He picked it up carefully. The label was blank. The next morning he found the only photo shop in town, run by an older man whose hands trembled when he handled the chemicals. "This is old stock," the man said, squinting at the roll. "Haven't seen this kind in years. You sure you want to develop it?" Michael nodded. "Please." When the photos emerged, still damp and curling at the edges, Michael felt his breath catch. They were all of him. In one, he was sitting in his apartment, staring out the window. In another, he was walking down a crowded street, his head turned just slightly as if sensing something behind him. There were even photos of him sleeping. The angles were too intimate, too precise. She had been close, watching, but the last photo was different. It wasn't of him. It was a shot of a narrow alley, sunlight cutting through the dust like a blade. And there, painted faintly on the brick wall, were 4 words in black letters: "The truth costs more." Michael stood in silence, the air thick with chemical fumes and disbelief. That night he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following him. Every reflection in a shop window, every face on the street seemed sharper, more deliberate. He tried to tell himself he was being paranoid, but then came the envelope, slipped under his door while he slept. No name, no return address. Inside, another photograph. It was the same alley, same words, but this time a shadow stretched across the wall, a man's shadow, his on the back, in her handwriting. "Do you understand yet?" He did, and he didn't. The question wasn't just about her. It was about everything: the silence he'd bought, the truths he'd buried, the ghosts that never stopped following him. He decided to find her, not for closure, but because the only way to silence the noise in his head was to face whatever truth she was trying to show him. The next day he tracked down a gallery owner who'd once exhibited her work. The woman, mid-40s, sharpened, recognized Anna's name immediately. "She's brilliant," she said softly, "and reckless. She never just took pictures, she uncovered stories people wanted buried. Last I heard, she was working on something big, something dangerous." "What kind of dangerous?" The woman hesitated. "The kind that doesn't end with applause." Michael pressed for more, but she refused to say. Before he left, she handed him a folded flyer from a recent exhibition. On the back was a list of sponsors. One name stood out: a development firm, the same one from the scandal years ago. Everything was circling back. He spent the next few days digging old contacts, old numbers. Every thread led him to the same place, a decommissioned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where Anna had once set up temporary dockrooms. When he arrived, the building loomed like a memory, half-forgotten rusted metal, broken windows, graffiti peeling from the walls. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke. He found traces of her everywhere: photo negatives pinned to string, a tattered notebook filled with scribbled names, dates, sketches of faces, and then footsteps. He turned. A figure stood in the doorway, haloed by the weak light of afternoon. It was her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them carried years of unfinished sentences. "You found me," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than he remembered. "You wanted me to." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. Maybe he took a step closer. "What is all this, Anna? The photos, the messages, the camera. What are you trying to tell me?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That you can't bury what you helped build." He felt the words like a blow. "You think I don't know that? I've been living with it every day." "Knowing isn't the same as owning," she said. "You paid me to disappear, but the truth didn't go with me. It stayed with you." He tried to speak, but she stepped closer, her eyes sharp and searching. "You still think this is about guilt?" She said. "It's not. It's about consequence." From her bag she pulled a photograph and handed it to him. It showed a collapsed structure, a building he recognized. The same project that had ended his career. "2 people died last month," she said. "The foundation failed. The same design you signed off on years ago." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "They covered it up again," she continued. "Different names, different company, same pattern. You think it ended when you paid me off? It didn't. It just got quieter." He looked at the image, the debris frozen mid-collapse, the smoke still curling upward. "Why show me this now?" "Because," she said softly, "you're the only one left who can stop it. And because I needed you to remember who you were before you started running." Silence, the kind that fills every corner, thick with things unsaid. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood what her absence had really been. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. When he opened them again, she was watching him. There was sadness there, but something else tore us off. "I can help you," he said. "We can fix this." She shook her head. You can't fix what you don't face. And then she turned, walking toward the door. On her way, she paused, her silhouette framed in the dying light. If you really want to help, she said, be at the old site tomorrow night, midnight. Come alone. And before he could answer, she was gone, her footsteps fading into the echo of the warehouse, leaving behind only the smell of dust and the faint hum of the city beyond. He stood there for a long time, the photograph still in his hands. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, low and heavy, as if the world itself was warning him, when he finally stepped out into the night. The wind carried the scent of rain, again the same scent as the night he'd paid her to leave. Only this time, he knew he couldn't buy his way out of what was coming. He didn't know what he would find at that construction site, or whether Anna would even be there. But as lightning flared over the skyline, one truth burned clearer than ever. Some debts can't be paid with money, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the guilt, he felt something shift, an old, buried part of himself waking up. The storm broke as he reached the car, rain hammering against the windshield, each drop loud and relentless. He started the engine. Midnight wasn't far, but neither was the reckoning that waited there. The rain didn't let up all night. It came down in sheets, blurring the road ahead into streaks of silver and gray. Michael gripped the steering wheel, the wipers thrashing back and forth like a metronome, marking time towards something inevitable. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of black water reflecting flashes of lightning. Each strike illuminated the world for a fraction of a second, trees bending in the wind, empty billboards, and the occasional lonely gas station standing like a beacon in the storm. By the time he reached the construction site, it was almost midnight. The place had been abandoned for years, an unfinished skeleton of concrete and steel, its bones jutting against the night sky. Floodlights flickered intermittently, running on some dying generator, casting ghost-like shadows that shifted with every gust of wind. He parked a short distance away and stepped out into the storm. The air smelled of wet metal and earth. His shoes sank slightly into the mud as he walked toward the gate, where a single padlock hung broken, as if someone had already been there. He hesitated, heart pounding, scanning the darkness for movement. "Anna," he called out, but the rain swallowed his voice. Then, faintly, a light had came from inside one of the unfinished buildings, pulsing irregularly, a flashlight or lantern moving between rooms. He followed it, his footsteps echoing through puddles and hollow corridors. Inside, the sound of dripping water filled the silence. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling like veins, and the air was thick with the smell of rust. The beam of light flashed again, just ahead. He moved toward it. When he turned the corner, she was there. Anna stood in the center of the concrete room, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. The light came from a lantern at her feet, casting her in a soft, uneven glow. She didn't look surprised to see him, just tired, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "You came," she said quietly. "I said I would." For a few seconds, neither moved. The rain drummed on the roof above, steady, relentless. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally. "Not tonight. You told me to come. I needed to know if you still would." He frowned, confused. What does that mean? But she didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the same one he'd seen back in the warehouse. She handed it to him. "Everything's in there," she said. "Names, dates, contracts, photographs. The real story." He flipped through it. Handwritten notes filled every page, some in her sharp, slanted script, others copied from reports. There were names he recognized, executives, politicians, even journalists. But there was something else too. On several pages his own name appeared, underlined. He looked up at her. "Why am I in this?" "Because," she said softly, "you're not just part of what happened. You're the reason it hasn't stopped." The words hit like a slap. "That's not true. I walked away." She shook her head slowly. "You walked away from the noise, not the system. They rebuilt it, rebranded it, and they used your old designs to do it. You may have quit, but your fingerprints are still all over the damage." Michael felt the ground tilt beneath him. "You think I wanted this?" he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to fix things." "No," she cut in, her tone sharp. "You tried to forget." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the water leaking from a crack in the ceiling. Then, somewhere outside, a metallic clang echoed through the site, loud, sudden, unmistakable. Michael froze. What was that? Anna's expression darkened. "We're not alone." Before he could ask what she meant, the lantern flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. He reached for her, but she was already moving. "Follow me," she whispered. They ran through the maze of half-built walls, their footsteps splashing through puddles, the storm roaring above. Somewhere behind them, another pair of footsteps echoed, steady, deliberate, following. They reached a stairwell, the wind howling through the open floors. Anna climbed quickly, her flashlight cutting through the dark. Michael followed, his pulse racing. "Who's out there?" he called. She didn't answer. At the top floor, they ducked into a small office overlooking the city. The walls were bare, the windows shattered. She pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to him. "If anything happens to me, you take this to the press," she said. "Anna, What are you talking about? There's someone here who doesn't want this story told. The same people who paid to bury the first one. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, recent ones. Construction sites that looked eerily familiar. Buildings rising on old blueprints. His blueprints. They're still using your work, she said. They changed the signatures, but the design flaws are the same. Another collapse is coming. You can stop it this time, but only if you tell the truth. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the structure. Somewhere below, the footsteps grew louder. Michael, she said, her eyes steady. You have to decide what kind of man you are now. The one who pays for silence or the one who finally listens. Before he could answer, glass shattered behind them. A figure stepped through the broken window frame, a man in a raincoat, face obscured by shadow. He held something metallic in his hand, glinting in the lightning. Anna grabbed Michael's arm. Run. They bolted down the corridor, the man following. The sound of boots on concrete echoed like gunfire. They turned corner after corner until they reached a dead-end, a wall of rebar and broken scaffolding. Michael turned, ready to fight, but Anna was gone. Anna, he shouted, no response. Only the rain and the soft hum of distant machinery. He retraced his steps, calling her name. But the building felt different, now warped, maze-like, as if the walls themselves were shifting. He reached the stairwell again, breathless, and stopped. The lantern from before lay at the bottom of the stairs, flickering weakly. Next to it, a single photograph face up in the water. He bent down to pick it up. It was a photo of him and Anna taken years ago, during the days when things still made sense. They were laughing, a hand on his cheek. But scrawled across the image in black ink were 3 words. She was right. A chill ran through him. He turned the photo over. On the back, another message. You were never supposed to find her. The thunder rolled again, louder this time, shaking dust from the ceiling. He looked around, but the man was gone. The footsteps, the chase, everything had gone eerily still. For a long time he stood there, listening to the storm rage outside, trying to understand what any of it meant. Was Anna in danger? Was she part of something larger? And who had written that message then? His phone buzzed. Unknown number. One new message. He hesitated, then opened it. It was a photo, grainy low light. Anna sitting in the same office they'd just fled from, looking directly at the camera. The time stamp read 2 hours before he arrived. His stomach dropped. The message beneath it was short. She knew you'd come alone. For the first time, the rain outside seemed to fade into silence, the world narrowing to the screen in his hand. He read the message again, the implications settling like ice in his chest. If the photo was real, then who had he spoken to tonight? He replayed every detail in his mind, the sound of her voice, the way she'd handed him the notebook, the smell of rain and dust on her coat. It had all felt real, too real. But now, doubt crept in like fog, the figure that appeared and disappeared, the shifting shadows, the sudden darkness. What if the entire encounter had been orchestrated? He looked down at the notebook still clutched in his hand. The pages were soaked, the ink bleeding into unreadable smudges. He flipped through it, desperate to find something tangible, proof she'd really been there. Halfway through, a photograph slipped free and fell to the ground. He picked it up. It showed the same warehouse where he'd found her earlier that week, but in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the background, was him, standing in the doorway holding a photograph. A loop, a moment repeating itself. He felt dizzy, the world spinning. None of this made sense anymore. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. Somewhere deep inside, a new thought surfaced, quiet but persistent. What if Anna hadn't been warning him about the company? What if she'd been warning him about something else entirely? He left the building just before dawn, the storm breaking apart into mist. The city beyond the horizon glowed faintly, indifferent to whatever truth he was still chasing. He drove without direction for hours, the photograph on the passenger seat beside him, the ink-smudged notebook in his lap. Every mile took him further from answers and closer to something he couldn't yet name, a presence, a pattern, a truth waiting to be uncovered. As the sun rose over the wet horizon, he pulled over by the side of the road and stared out across the landscape. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt soaked in something heavier. He opened the notebook again, flipping to the last few pages. The handwriting there was different, neater, more deliberate, and it wasn't Anna's. The final entry read, "He believes she's still alive. Keep it that way until he signs." His breath caught. The ink was still fresh. He turned the page, and for the first time, he saw a photograph taped there. It was of him sitting at his own kitchen table, holding the first envelope, the one he'd given Anna years ago. Below it, a signature. His own. The message beneath was short. The silence you paid for was never hers. He closed the notebook slowly, his reflection flickering in the window glass. Outside, the world was waking ordinary, oblivious, but inside, everything he thought he knew was unraveling. Maybe she was alive. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she never left at all. And as the light grew brighter, he whispered into the empty car, not sure who he was speaking to anymore. "What did I pay for, Anna?" A whisper of wind slipped through the crack of the window, carrying the faintest sound, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. The sound of a camera shutter clicking once, then twice, and somewhere, just beyond the edge of the rising light, a voice, familiar, calm, almost tender, whispered back, The story you forgot to finish. The sound of that voice lingered like smoke, thin, uncertain, impossible to place. Michael held his breath, staring into the mirror's reflection. Nothing but his own eyes stared back, wide and bloodshot. The car's interior seemed to close in around him, the hum of the engine a low, steady pulse beneath the silence. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached for the notebook again. The ink on the final entry was still damp, faintly smudged where his fingers had brushed the words. Someone had written it recently, someone who knew where he'd be. He looked out the window, scanning the empty road. The early morning fog wrapped around everything like a curtain, hiding what lay beyond. The story you forgot to finish. He whispered it aloud, trying to make sense of it. The phrase didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a reminder, or an invitation. He turned the key and the car roared back to life, the sound tearing through the still air. The only place that made sense to go was back to where it had all started. The city, the firm, the hollow buildings that bore his blueprints like scars. As he drove, the fog thinned, revealing long stretches of coastline. The water gleamed pale under the dawn, the kind of gray that looked more like memory than light. Every few miles he caught glimpses of himself in the rearview mirror, man unraveling, pulled by a thread he couldn't stop following. By the time he reached the city limits, the streets were waking. Vendors opening shutters, buses sighing through intersections. The ordinary rhythm of life carrying on, unaware of the ghosts moving quietly through its edges. He parked a block away from his old office building. The glass tower rose like an accusation against the sky, clean, polished, rebuilt. Different name now, different logo, but the same bones beneath the surface. He stood on the sidewalk, watching people flow in and out, each one swiping keycards that had once opened doors under his authority. He thought of Anna's notebook, the names inside it, the signatures that mirrored his own. If what she said was true, if they were still using his old designs, then this building was more than a monument to ambition. It was a living lie. He slipped inside, unnoticed. The lobby smelled of new paint and artificial flowers, an attempt at freshness that couldn't mask the rot underneath. He rode the elevator up, each floor clicking past like seconds counting down. On the 21st floor, he found what he was looking for, the same conference room where he'd signed the contract years ago, the day he sold his silence. The walls were different now, new art, softer lighting, but the air was the same. Too clean, too controlled. He stood there, staring at the long glass table, and for a moment it felt like time folded in on itself. He could almost see his younger self sitting there, sharp suit, confident smile, pretending not to notice the documents that had already been altered before they reached his hands. And then, behind him, the sound of footsteps. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was deep, calm, familiar. Michael turned. A man stood in the doorway, mid-50s, gray suit, a face carved from stillness. He recognized him instantly. Jonathan Pierce, his former superior. The man who had built an empire on other people's compromises. "I needed to see it," Michael said. Pierce closed the door. "You've been stirring up things that should have stayed buried." Michael held up the notebook. "You mean this? The truth?" Pierce's expression didn't change. "You always were naive. You think truth is something clean. It's not. It's a negotiation." "2 people are dead," Michael said. "Buildings are collapsing. How much more blood do you need to buy peace?" Pierce's voice softened, almost pitying. "You think this is about peace? No, it's about order. Someone has to build the world you live in, even if the foundation cracks along the way." The words hung between them, heavy as steel. Michael took a step closer. "You used my work to keep it going. You forged my name. You forged it first," Pierce said quietly. "Don't you remember? You signed what you didn't read. You didn't care where the money came from, as long as it came fast. You started this." Michael's throat tightened. For a second he couldn't breathe. Pierce was right and wrong. The truth was tangled now, impossible to separate from guilt. "What did you do to her?" Michael asked finally. Pierce's eyes flickered, just once. "She was a problem. Problems get managed." Michael felt the floor tilt again, the room closing in. "Is she alive?" Pierce smiled faintly, almost kindly. "You tell me. You've been chasing her shadow for weeks." Something cold moved through Michael's chest. What does that mean? But Pierce only glanced at the notebook in his hands. "You still don't see it, do you? The story's already written. You just don't know which part of it you belong to." And with that, he turned and walked out, the soft click of the door echoing like a gunshot. Michael stood alone in the room, the hum of the city vibrating through the windows. He wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, but something else stopped him. The lights above flickered once, twice, then steadied. The air conditioner kicked on, blowing cold air through the vents. A whisper followed, faint but unmistakable. "Michael." He spun around. No one. The voice came again, softer this time, but closer. He shouldn't have come back. He dropped the notebook. It hit the table with a dull thud, pages fanning open to the middle. His eyes caught on a photograph taped there. It was grainy, black and white, but clear enough to recognize the setting. The very room he was standing in, and there, sitting at the table, was Anna, only she looked older, tired, Behind her, standing in the shadows, was him. He stared at the image, his pulse pounding. The time stamp on the corner read 2 days from now. Lightning flashed outside, reflecting off the glass, and for an instant he thought he saw movement in the window, a reflection that wasn't his. A woman's silhouette, just behind him. He turned, but there was only empty space. The notebook's pages fluttered in the draft, and beneath the photograph, another message appeared in faint, handwritten ink. Stop chasing ghosts, start remembering. The air in the room thickened. He picked up the notebook again, flipping through the earlier pages, noticing details he hadn't seen before, phrases that seemed to speak directly to him. He doesn't remember what he signed. He keeps looking for her instead of himself. He's the one who asked for silence. The words blurred, the letters bleeding together as if they'd been written in water. He closed the book, his hands shaking. Was he losing his mind? Or had he already lost it long ago? Outside, the rain began again, drumming against the windows in erratic bursts. The city below blurred into light and motion. He pressed his hand to the glass, trying to steady himself. Then, faintly, his phone buzzed again. Another message. No name, no number, just one line. Check the footage. Attached was a link. He hesitated, then opened it. The video began in darkness, the faint hiss of static. Slowly, an image emerged, a security feed from the very building he was in. The date stamp was tonight. He watched himself walk into the lobby, ride the elevator, step into the conference room. Everything matched exactly as it had happened. But then, after Pierce left, the feed showed something different. A second figure entered the room. A woman, Anna. She stood behind him, inches away, her face calm, unreadable. She reached out, her hand almost touching his shoulder, then stopped. She looked toward the camera instead, as if aware she was being watched, and then she smiled. The feed cut to static. Michael sat frozen, the phone trembling in his grip. His reflection in the window looked pale, ghost-like. She had been there, not in memory, not an illusion, physically there. But how? He replayed the video frame by frame, searching for proof of manipulation, an editing glitch. Something, nothing. It was seamless. His pulse hammered in his ears. He grabbed the notebook again, flipping back to the photograph that showed her in this room. The timestamp 2 days ahead flashed in his mind. The image, the message, the voice, they weren't leading him forward. They were leading him back. Every clue, every whisper, every encounter. What if it wasn't about finding her? What if it was about uncovering something he'd buried in himself? He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. In the faint reflection of the glass, the city lights rippled over his skin, and for a brief, impossible second, he saw another hand overlapping his smaller, delicate familiar. He jerked back, the illusion breaking. The notebook slipped from his fingers again and fell open to the very first page. There, scrawled in the same sharp handwriting he now knew by heart, were words that hadn't been there before. If you want to find me, stop running from the moment you paid me. The lights flickered once more. He closed his eyes, the memory rushing back, the envelope, the rain, her voice at the door. He'd told himself it was for her safety, that he was saving her, but the truth was heavier, darker. He hadn't been saving her. He'd been saving himself from exposure, from guilt, from the consequences of what he'd done. And maybe she had known that all along. He opened his eyes. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the world suspended in stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, its echo fading into the hum of the city. He took one last look around the room, the ghost of his reflection mingling with hers in the glass, and whispered, "Where are you?" A faint light flickered on the far side of the street. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw her standing under a flickering street lamp, a gray coat draped around her shoulders, camera hanging from her neck. She was looking up at the building, straight toward him. For a second, time folded. The city fell away. He pressed a hand to the window. Her lips moved, silent, unreadable. Then she lifted the camera and took a single photo, the flash cutting through the dark. And just like that, she was gone. The light blinked out. Only the faint after-image of her face lingered against the glass, slowly fading as dawn began to rise. Michael turned toward the notebook, the pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. One final note had appeared in the margin, the ink glistening wet. "Tomorrow, it ends." He stood in the stillness, the sound of his own breathing loud in the quiet, the weight of inevitability pressing in from all sides. Whatever was coming, it had already started moving toward him, and this time, there would be no place left to hide. The next morning broke like a held breath, released a sun-gray light spilling through the blinds, slicing across the room in narrow, trembling lines. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, unmoving. He hadn't slept. The city outside was muted, as if holding itself back, the usual hum replaced by something quieter, waiting. On the nightstand, the notebook lay open where he'd left it, its final words, "Tomorrow, it ends," catching the dull light. He traced the letters with his thumb. The ink had faded slightly, but the message still pulsed, alive beneath the surface. He rose and walked to the window. The street below was slick from the night's rain, cars sliding past like shadows. He thought of the woman beneath the lamp, the flash of her camera cutting through the dark. Anna. The image replayed in his mind with unbearable clarity, her expression, calm but unreadable, like she knew he'd come to this moment all along, and maybe she had. He picked up the phone. No new messages, no number to call back, just silence. The kind that felt designed, deliberate. He turned back to the notebook. Beneath the final line, a faint outline had appeared overnight, letters emerging where before there had been none, as though written in invisible ink. If you want the truth, come to where it began. He knew exactly what that meant. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the sun had climbed weakly over the skyline, washed out gold over concrete and smoke. The road wound along the river, through the old industrial district, warehouses half collapsed, windows boarded up, walls scrawled with paint and rot. He parked beside a familiar ruin. The first structure he and Anna had ever worked on together, the one that started everything. The gates hung crooked, rust bleeding through their hinges. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and history. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the cavernous hall. Shafts of light pierced the roof where panels had fallen away, illuminating floating motes like tiny ghosts suspended in air. He remembered their laughter here, years ago. Late nights sketching plans on walls with chalk, their voices bouncing off the empty space. She'd called it a cathedral of possibility. He'd called it a start. Now it felt more like a tomb. In the center of the floor stood a single chair on it, an old tape recorder. A red light blinked slowly. He hesitated, then pressed play. The tape hissed before a voice filled the space. Soft, steady, her voice. "You were right to come back," Anna said. "I knew you would. You always return to what you've tried to forget." He closed his eyes. The sound of her was almost unbearable, live, close, unbroken by time. "I wanted to show you something," she continued. "Not the buildings, not the lies. You already know those. This is about what we did to each other, what you did to me." He opened his eyes. The chair sat empty before him, the recorder glowing faintly in the half. "I didn't take the money for silence, Michael. I took it because I thought that's what you wanted. You wanted me gone so you could live with what you'd done. But the truth doesn't disappear when you pay it to leave, it just changes shape." It waits, a faint echo caught in the air, something beyond her voice, a sound like a shutter clicking. The recording continued, softer now, as if she'd moved closer to the microphone. "They told me you signed it all willingly, that you sold the project knowing what it would do. I didn't believe them. I thought you were trapped like I was. But when I saw the signatures, when I saw your name on the falsified specs," a pause, "the kind that splits something open, I realized you'd chosen them over us." Michael's breath caught. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the recorder played on, indifferent to time. "I disappeared because I couldn't stand to see what you'd become," she said. "But even gone, I couldn't stop caring. So I watched, I followed the ruins you built. Every collapse, every shadow that bore your mark. You paid me to stay away, but your silence called louder than any words could." He pressed his palm to his forehead, eyes burning. "I left the notebook for you," she said. "Every name in it is a life that was buried to build something hollow, but there's one name missing. Yours, because you're the last one who can put an end to it." The tape clicked, then rewound itself with a mechanical whir. He stood there for a long moment, letting the echo of her voice fade. The truth wasn't a single revelation, it was a series of fractures widening until everything fell through. He turned toward the far wall. There, half hidden beneath layers of dust and grime, was a mural, something they'd painted together. A rough outline of a skyline, unfinished. Beneath it, a line in faded white chalk, built something worth the weight of its shadows. He walked closer. At the base of the wall, a sheet of paper had been taped. Old, yellowed, curling at the corners. It was a blueprint. His signature at the bottom, but across it, in Anna's handwriting scrawled in dark ink, "This is where the lie began." And beneath that, smaller, a date, October 25th, 2015. Exactly 10 years ago. He knelt, tracing the lines of the blueprint with trembling fingers. It wasn't one of their major projects. It was smaller, a private commission, long forgotten. A building that had burned down just months after completion. He remembered the fire, the news reports, the single casualty they'd never named. A realization struck him cold. He looked closer. The design bore a flaw. One he'd missed or ignored when he'd signed off. The same flaw that had caused the collapse. And there, tucked into the corner of the plan, almost invisible, was a name, Annis. She had worked on it. He stumbled back, breath faltering. The fire, the silence afterward. The night she came to his door, her eyes hollow, her words trembling. "They're saying, it's my fault, Michael, but it's not. You know it's not." He'd told her he'd handle it, that he'd make it go away. And he had, by signing an agreement that pinned it on her instead. That was the payment. Not for her silence, for his absolution. The weight of it hit him all at once. The years of denial, of half-remembered dreams and rewritten justifications, crashing through him like a wave. He'd built his future on the ruin of her life, and she'd spent the rest of hers trying to remind him. He turned back to the recorder. It was still running, a soft hum filling the silence. Then, faintly, her voice again. Different this time, newer, closer. "I forgive you," she said. "But forgiveness doesn't erase what's been built. You have to tear it down yourself." The tape clicked off. Michael stood there, the world around him narrowing to the sound of his own breathing. Tear it down. He looked up at the structure towering above him, the beams, the cracked windows, the rotted metal, all of it a symbol of what he'd made, what he'd destroyed. He took a step back, then another, until he stood in the center of the hall again. The light had shifted now, cutting across the floor in sharp angles, illuminating dust like sparks. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, the city inspector's office. When the voice answered, he spoke quietly, deliberately. "My name is Michael Reed. I need to report a structural fraud. Multiple sites, all traced to my name." The voice on the other end was startled, asking questions he didn't hear. His eyes stayed on the blueprint pinned to the wall. "I'll send everything I have," he said, "and then, you'll find me where it began." He hung up. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and steady. The storm was returning. He gathered the notebook, the blueprint, the recorder, and walked out into the rain. By the time he reached the river, the sky had darkened again. The water churned, restless, mirroring his reflection in broken fragments. He stood at the edge, wind slicing through his coat. The city skyline loomed in the distance, his skyline, built on compromise. He opened the notebook one last time. The final page was blank. For a moment he thought that was the end. But as the rain struck the paper, words began to appear, faint and glowing in the wet. "Every story needs an ending, even the ones we run from." He smiled, small, hollow, real. Then he tore the page free and let it drift into the river, watching it twist and dissolve into the current. Somewhere behind him, a shutter clicked. He turned. Anna stood a few feet away, coat-soaked, camera in hand. Her hair clung to her face, her expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "You finally remembered." He nodded. "I should have sooner." Rain streamed down their faces, indistinguishable from tears. She stepped closer. "It's never too late to tell the truth, but it costs everything." "I know." Her eyes met his, searching, breaking, forgiving. Then she raised the camera one last time. "This is the last picture," she said. He didn't move. The flash cut through the rain like lightning, freezing the moment to the man who'd built lies, and the woman who'd carried their weight. When his vision cleared, she was gone. Only the echo of the shutter remained. He looked down at the river. The page already vanished beneath its dark surface. The city lights shimmered across the water, fractured but alive. And for the first time in years, he felt the silence lift, not vanish, but soften, like the end of a storm that had raged too long. He turned and walked toward the faint glow of morning, the rain easing behind him. Somewhere he imagined her still walking to some parallel road, some other life. Both of them finally moving forward from the ruins they'd made. He didn't know if redemption was possible, but maybe, just maybe, the sound of her absence would no longer be too loud to bear. The rain had passed by dawn. What remained was a silence that felt earned, the kind that follows a confession, or the first breath after years of holding one in. The city was waking, washed clean by the night storm. Cars glided through slick streets that glimmered gold beneath the pale light, and the air smelled of wet stone and something like renewal. Michael stood on the edge of the bridge, looking down at the river. The current had calmed, smooth and dark, reflecting the faint blush of sunrise. Somewhere beneath its surface, the final page of Anna's notebook drifted unseen, its ink dissolving into the flow. He imagined her words scattering like seeds in the water, small, fragile truths finding new places to rest. For the first time in years he felt still, not numb, not burdened, just still. The city's skyline stretched before him, the monuments of his ambition, the weight of his past cast in glass and steel. He used to see them as proof of success. Now they looked like echoes of the person he'd been, bright, untouchable, but hollow inside. He'd always told himself that progress required sacrifice, that the cost of creation was loss. But standing here now, with the wind brushing against his collar and the world slowly waking, he understood the lie in that. The things we build, the bridges, the towers, the futures, mean nothing if they rise from denial. Every structure he'd ever designed had been built to hide something, a mistake, a truth, a love too heavy to face. He closed his eyes and saw her again, Anna standing beneath the flickering streetlight. The flash of her camera, that brief, silent understanding between them. She hadn't come for revenge, or even closure. She'd come to remind him of who he was before he forgot. The architect who built with hope instead of fear, the man who saw beauty in imperfection. A soft breeze carried the smell of rain and iron. Somewhere far below, a train rumbled across the lower tracks, disappearing into a tunnel. The sound felt final, a chapter closing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the recorder. It was still damp from the rain, the metal cold against his palm. He pressed play one last time. Her voice filled the air, faint but clear. "If you're hearing this, it means you found your way back. Don't waste it. Don't build more walls trying to hold the past together. Let it fall. Let it become part of the ground you stand on." The tape clicked off. He stood there for a while, watching the morning grow brighter. Then he smiled, small, real, almost shy, and let the recorder slip from his hand into the river below. It hit the surface with a soft splash and vanished. When he turned, the city no longer looked the same. The glass towers still rose against the sky. But now he could see through them, not literally, but in a way that made their transparency feel deliberate. They were no longer symbols of failure or deceit. They were reminders, markers of the cost of forgetting. Proof that even in ruin, something can still reflect the light. He started walking. Each step felt lighter, as if the air itself had thinned. The streets filled slowly with people, strangers, each carrying their own invisible stories. He moved among them unnoticed, another face in the tide of mourning. But inside, something had shifted. He passed a construction site on the corner, the skeleton of a new building reaching into the sky. Workers moved methodically across the beams, welding and measuring, their voices rising and falling in rhythm. He stopped to watch. The sound reminded him of the old warehouse, the laughter and arguments, the smell of chalk and metal dust, the beginnings before ambition drowned everything else. One of the workers looked down, caught his gaze, and nodded politely. Michael nodded back. There was something beautiful in that simple exchange, the quiet acknowledgement that every life, no matter how fractured, keeps building, keeps trying. He found himself walking toward his old office, though not with the same urgency as before. The doors were open now. Investigators moved in and out, carrying boxes of documents, photographs, blueprints. The truth was out. Whatever happened next, hearings, charges, consequences didn't scare him anymore. He'd already faced the worst part himself. A woman with a clipboard approached. Mr. Reed, he hesitated, then nodded. She handed him a folder. We found this among the recovered materials. It has your name on it. Inside were old sketches, his earliest ones, hand-drawn, imperfect, full of passion. Among them was one he didn't remember making, a rough sketch of a small house by a river. It wasn't grand or modern. It was simple, human. A note at the bottom read, "For her." He ran his thumb along the faded pencil lines. The drawing was soft, almost hesitant, as if made by someone who still believed in gentleness. He closed the folder and handed it back. "Keep it," he said quietly. "It belongs with the rest." Outside, the sunlight finally broke through the clouds, spreading across the city in a slow, golden tide. The glass towers caught it all at once, shimmering in unison like a single living thing. The reflection poured down onto the river, lighting it from within. He walked toward the waterfront, following the light. When he reached the edge, he stopped and looked out. The water moved lazily now, the chaos of the storm replaced by something calm, almost forgiving. The city hummed softly behind him, alive but gentler somehow. He wondered if Anna was still out there somewhere between the noise and the quiet. Maybe she'd gone far away. Maybe she was close enough to see him now. He imagined her camera, the final photograph she'd taken, the one that had captured him standing in the rain. He wondered what it looked like, if she'd developed it, if she'd kept it. Maybe that photo wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about the moment itself, the bridge between guilt and grace, the thin space where two broken people finally understood each other. He breathed in deeply, the air cool and alive in his lungs. There were still things to answer for, still truths to tell. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Not as punishment, as restoration. He took a step closer to the railing, watching the sunlight dance across the rippling water. In the reflection, the skyline stretched and shimmered, bending and breaking into 1,000 fragments, but in each fragment there was light, and maybe that was enough. He thought about all the years he'd spent building things meant to last forever, never realizing that permanence was an illusion. Everything changes, everything fades. But in that fading, there's beauty, the kind that only exists when you finally stop trying to control the outcome. He whispered her name once, softly, into the breeze. It carried the sound across the water and disappeared into the horizon. Somewhere, a distant echo of laughter reached him, faint, familiar, impossible. He smiled. The wind lifted, tugging at his coat, and for a moment he imagined her beside him again, the warmth of her presence, the scent of rain still in her hair. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the quiet space inside every redemption story, the part that stays even after the storm is gone. He turned from the river and began walking back into the city. The morning light followed, long shadows stretching ahead of him. Behind him, the water kept moving, steady and endless, carrying fragments of ink and paper toward places unknown. Maybe that's what forgiveness really was, not forgetting, not erasing, but allowing what once was broken to keep moving forward. He looked up at the skyline one last time. The buildings shimmered like glass reflections of who he'd been, who he was, and who he might still become. For the first time, they didn't look like lies, they looked like lessons. The world around him was waking now, horns, footsteps, conversations blending into one continuous living hum. He walked into it slowly, deliberately, each step a quiet promise. Somewhere far away, a camera shutter clicked once more, the sound soft but certain, as if marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. And in that small, perfect silence after, the question remained, not heavy, but necessary. Lingering in the space between heartbeats, what do we owe to the ones who tried to save us from ourselves, and can we ever truly pay them back? Except by finally learning how to live. The river flowed on, the light deepened, the city breathed, and for the first time, Michael Reed walked forward without the weight of absence behind him, only the quiet, enduring presence of everything he had finally learned to face.